We are meeting today on the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Boodja, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Australia-Cuba Friendship Society in WA calls for the blockade on Cuba to be lifted. The goal of the Cuban government is to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages by universal health care. The ACFS in Perth cannot stand by and allow this pursuit to be hindered by an unjust blockade by the US administration. The blockade cost Cuban public health $2.5 billion and in an even greater threat hinders the ability to purchase much needed equipment and medicines. Globally, this should be the time of the greatest cooperation. But the US administration has chosen this time to maximise its brutality. Going as far as to try and dissuade other countries from accepting help from Cuban medical brigades. And we stand by the nomination of the Cuban Medical Brigade for the Henry Reeve Brigade for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. The World Health Organization has identified that in addition to domestic responsibilities, national leaders have obligations at the world at large. Global leaders have pledged to accelerate cooperation on a coronavirus vaccine and to share research, treatment and medicines across the globe. The US has declined to join the pledge. The Trump US government instead has continued to apply the economic, commercial and financial blockade against Cuba with full force, ramping things up during this time of COVID-19. The US administration says the sanctions are necessary against the troika of tyranny, Cuba, Venezuela and Nicaragua, expressing concern that the perils of poisonous ideologies will be left unchecked. Comparing with what the US, the most affluent country in the world, delivers against the so-called poisonous ideology is delivering for the Cuban people and many others around the world. During this time of COVID-19, the US has stockpiled almost 90% of the world's supply of the antiviral medication Remdesivir, denying access to the rest of the world. They have intercepted deliveries of ventilators, face masks and diagnostic kits to Cuba. During this time of COVID-19, Cuba has activated 28 medical brigades in 24 countries, using its skills to deliver humanitarian aid where it's needed, sharing what they have while continuing to care for Cubans at home. Despite almost 59 years of living under this cruel, unjust blockade, in Cuba there is free healthcare for all, while in the US 36.2 million people go hungry and 47 million lack health coverage. It's ironic that the Cubans who live in what Washington has deemed a closed society are allowed by their government to travel freely to the United States without limitation, while US citizens living under a supposed liberal democracy are banned from travelling freely to Cuba by the US administration. We stand in solidarity with the Cuban people. We call on the US administration and President Trump to develop just and civilised diplomatic relations with Cuba. We call for an end of the US blockade on Cuba, the return of Guantanamo Bay, and an end to all regime change policies sponsored by the US government. We call on the Australian government to challenge the extraterritorial US assault against the sovereignty of Cuba. We join with many others around the world in this call and in solidarity with the Cuban people in their struggle against this cruel blockade. We give our unreserved commitment that we will continue with our protests at the US consulate until the blockade is lifted. We call for the United States to respect the vote of the UN General Assembly that has called for the blockade to be lifted 27 times. We call on the United States to respect the 23 years of voting by the Australian government condemning the blockade on Cuba. Lift the blockade on
Lift the blockade on Cuba.
What do we want?
Lift the
Lift
blockade on
blockade
Cuba.
on Cuba. When do we want it?
Now.